It's an emergency, rebellion, an insurrection, and clearly an invasion of Mexicans. Just look at all those flags.
Well, they're not a city of immigrants, they're a city of criminals.
According to Donald Trump, Los Angeles is a war zone, and the only thing that can restore order is thousands of soldiers and hundreds of Marines patrolling the streets. Also, the only way to stop a fire is by lighting a match. Last Friday, President Trump sent heavily armored ICE agents in to conduct immigration raids in densely populated neighborhoods in and around Los Angeles without informing local law enforcement or city authorities. He claimed to be liberating the city from dangerous migrants, the worst of the worst, including dozens of textile factory workers, a bunch of laborers outside a Home Depot, and this guy selling fruit on the street corner. Protests immediately erupted across the city and were predominantly peaceful, but a few of them were not, including the downtown protest where about 5 parked robo-taxis were lit on fire, which, if you know anybody from Los Angeles, that's kind of a thing they do there, especially when the Lakers win the championship. But that didn't stop the Trump administration from jumping at the opportunity to grab power away from the states, even when the Constitution pretty clearly forbids it. He's also mobilized the National Guard outside of his authority, threatened to arrest Governor Gavin Newsom, and mobilized 700 active duty Marines to support ICE, rounding up even more immigrants. Yikes. On Friday, June 6th, ICE conducted a series of immigration raids in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. According to Representative Nanette Barragan, they're going to keep this up for a month.
So we've been told to get ready for 30 days of enforcement. 30 days of ICE enforcement.
Agents swept multiple locations in the city and took at least 118 people into custody, but 3 locations became particular flashpoints. The first was a garment factory called Ambiance Apparel in the Fashion District. Agents entered the building and interrogated the workers inside, but while that was going on, a crowd of angry protesters surrounded the building. Those protesters included David Huerta, leader of the Service Employees International Union, better known as SEIU, one of the biggest labor unions in the country, who was arrested for impeding ICE agents. Bill Asalee, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of California, tweeted out a photo of Huerta after he'd been slammed to the ground in the back of a cruiser with the promise to arraign him on Monday. Ah, for the good old days, when the Justice Department manual's instruction to prosecutors that they should not make any statement or disclose any information that could have a substantial likelihood of materially prejudicing a case actually meant something. See also Rule 3.6 of the California Rules of Professional Conduct. But where were we? Oh, right. ICE agents, FBI, and Los Angeles Police Department cops dispersed the crowd outside the garment factory using pepper spray and took about a dozen people to the Metropolitan Detention Center. Now, members of Congress have the right to inspect federal detention facilities. It's right there in Section 527 of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2024. And yet, multiple California representatives were turned away when they tried to enter that facility. Meanwhile, a huge crowd of protesters assembled outside because SEIU has 750,000 members, and they were pissed about the raids, and they were really pissed about Huerta being taken into custody. Now, the vast majority of those protesters were peaceful, but some of them were not. So ICE called LAPD, and the cops came and they caused the crowd to disperse. And perhaps if ICE had said they were going to stage raids in a major metro area or even told the police that they'd picked up Huerta, LAPD could have been on the scene sooner rather than arriving after things were already out of control. But ICE was not trying to work with local authorities, which is why no one knew that they would be massing forces for a raid on Saturday near the Home Depot in Paramount, a working-class Latino suburb southeast of LA. But the ICE guys stick out like a sore thumb, and so of course people spotted them and spread the word. An angry crowd began to form around the industrial park where the agents were massing, which is hardly surprising in a town that is 82% Hispanic and 32% immigrant. And so, before long, things got totally out of hand, with kids throwing rocks and water bottles at the caravan of ICE vehicles as it fled the town. And no one is condoning violence, but it is important to understand that these are communities where ICE is doing stuff like going into elementary schools and trying to interrogate first graders. So people are scared and they are angry. After the raids and the continued detention of Huerta, there was widespread protest across the city on Sunday and Monday. But by then, the LAPD had interposed themselves between ICE and the protesters, and they were the ones firing round after round of tear gas and pepper balls and less lethal rubber bullets, including at this Australian reporter. They literally just shot this woman for no reason. Here's the LAPD on horseback beating a protester, which is a good reminder that the last time the National Guard was on the streets of LA was in 1992 after police brutally beat a man named Rodney King. That attack, which was caught on tape, ignited a firestorm, and when the police were acquitted by a jury of the assault, it sparked widespread rioting. In what became known as the Rodney King riots, looting and arson were rampant. 63 people were killed, more than 2,000 were injured, and 12,000 were arrested. The city suffered more than $1 billion in property damage, and those were 1992 dollars. But in 1992, Los Angeles authorities knew that if the verdict in the Rodney King trial came back not guilty, the city was going to be furious, and so Mayor Tom Bradley preemptively put the National Guard on standby and called them up on the same night of the verdict when the violence erupted. Local officials are pretty good at knowing what the vibe is in their own city, and they're also pretty good at predicting how things are going to go down. And in the case of Los Angeles last Friday, they knew that the LAPD was well equipped to deal with the gathering protests, even though the ICE raids were sprung on them without warning. And what they got was thousands of peaceful demonstrators in a couple of locations and a handful of Waymo robo-taxis torched because their cameras effectively provide surveillance footage for the police. The LAPD has extensive experience with crowd control in its own streets, and it restored order within hours of being called in, albeit by shooting rubber bullets at protesters and reporters indiscriminately. And with all love for Californians, they do know how to stage an actual riot, like when UCLA won the championship in 1995, or when the Lakers beat the Celtics in the NBA Finals in 2010, or last year when the Dodgers beat the Yankees in Game 5. So to paraphrase Crocodile Dundee, that's not a riot, this is a riot. Here, the vast majority of Angelenos just went about their business and there's no widespread violence or looting. Police have matters well in hand, like what are the troops going to do in LA? Get brunch at Cantor's on Fairfax before hitting up Griffith Observatory? Meanwhile, Donald Trump spent the weekend firing off incendiary social media posts blaming California politicians for not putting out the fire fast enough after ICE lit it. He said, if Governor Gavin Newsom of California and Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles can't do their jobs, which everyone knows they can't, then the federal government will step in and solve the problem. Riots and looters, the way it should be solved. Trump's border czar Tom Homan threatened to arrest Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass for crossing that line, whatever that means.
I'll say it about anybody. You cross that line. It's a felony to knowingly harbor and conceal an illegal alien. It's a felony to impede law enforcement from doing their job.
The president said he thought that was a great idea. What are they going to arrest him for, Mr. President?
A crime has he committed? I think his primary crime is running for governor because he's done such a bad job.
And then Trump signed a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense for the protection of Department of Homeland Security functions. He said violent protests threaten the security of and significant damage to federal immigration detention facilities and other federal property. To the extent that protests or acts of violence directly inhibit the execution of the laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. Think about that for a second. He's saying that protests, civil disobedience, constitutes rebellion against the United States. I mean, by that logic, this is a rebellion, but not this, of course. He went on, in light of these incidents and credible threats of continued violence, I hereby call into federal service members and units of the National Guard under 10 U.S.C. Section 12406 to temporarily protect ICE and other United States government personnel and to protect federal property at locations where protests against these functions are occurring or are likely to occur based on current threat assessments and planned operations. And he directed Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth to call up at least 2,000 troops for a minimum of 60 days. Okay, there is a whole lot to unpack here. Section 12406 allows the president to federalize the National Guard in certain limited circumstances. That is, he can turn state militias into soldiers under the command of the federal government, not under command of the states. The first of those circumstances is when we are under foreign invasion, which we clearly are not. Although Trump says the city of Los Angeles is under migrant invasion and a whole bunch of his supporters are pointing to the presence of Mexican flags at the protest like it's evidence of something illegal.
They were literally out there protesting, carrying a foreign flag. That is absolutely insane. I mean, they're not just peaceful protesters. Well, these are illegals. These are exactly why the president is trying to secure our border.
It is not illegal to fly a flag, not even a rebel flag. And lots of people in America fly flags celebrating their heritage. It's not like we freak out every March because we think we're being invaded by Ireland. Pointing to Mexican Americans waving Mexican flags like it's some kind of crime it's just racist. I'm sorry. That's all it is. The second circumstance where state militias can be federalized is in the case of rebellion, which Trump has already defined downward to anyone disobeying the law. But is there an actual rebellion here against the government? I mean, clearly not. The third circumstance is when the president is unable with regular forces to execute the laws of the United States, which is obviously not the case. ICE arrested more than 100 immigrants over the weekend, and a whopping 6 of them were actually criminals, not just seamstresses and roofers and gardeners trying to earn a living and take care of their families. But okay, let's look at the last part of this statute. It says orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states, which certainly did not happen. California Governor Gavin Newsom did not approve this call-up of the state's National Guard. So we're batting 1,000 here. But let's go back to that declaration, because protests are First Amendment protected activity, and Trump is assembling thousands of troops to protect federal property at locations where protests against these functions are occurring or are likely to occur. So we could be looking at troops stationed anywhere in the country based on the Secretary of Defense's suspicion that there might be protests there. Not violence or rioting or obstruction, just protests, and for an unlimited length of time. After he signed the proclamation, President Trump immediately congratulated himself for restoring order to Los Angeles, despite the fact that no National Guardsmen were even on the ground yet. Pete Hegseth called the garment workers and landscapers ICE had rounded up a dangerous invasion facilitated by criminal cartels, aka foreign terrorist organizations, and a huge national security risk. And he threatened to put active duty Marines on the streets of LA, a suggestion Governor Newsom called deranged. But since then, Hegseth made good on that threat, mobilizing 700 Marines for deployment in Los Angeles. What he's going to do with those Marines is another matter. Newsom tweeted out photos of the California Guardsmen Trump summoned to Los Angeles sleeping on the floor since the government has made no provision to feed or house them, in contrast to the ICE agents who have been put up at local hotels where they are apparently interrogating the housekeepers making up their rooms and the kitchen staff demanding ID and proof of citizenship. But with the protests being almost universally peaceful, there's very little for the National Guard to do. As David Dian of the American Prospect wrote, the protests are largely clergy members and local politicians occupying public space with crowds chanting slogans and singing "We shall overcome." The phalanxes of police and soldiers sent to keep the peace are more or less superfluous, which is good because there's not a lot those soldiers can legally do. Under the Posse Comitatus Act, it's illegal to use the military to execute the laws. That means the government can't use the military to enforce immigration laws or police civilians unless... Over the weekend, California politicians urged protesters to stay peaceful. Gavin Newsom tweeted, "The federal government is taking over the California National Guard and deploying 2,000 soldiers in Los Angeles, not because there is a shortage of law enforcement, but because they want a spectacle. Do not give them one. Never use violence. Speak out peacefully." Senator Adam Schiff warned that there is nothing President Trump would like more than a violent confrontation with protesters to justify the unjustifiable, invocation of the Insurrection Act or some form of martial law. The fear here is that Trump will use minor incidents of violence as a pretext to pull the fire alarm and declare an emergency. And remember, he's claiming emergency authorization to seize Congress's tariff authority and deport migrants without due process, so probably a safe bet. Here, the emergency would be an insurrection, empowering Trump to call into federal service such of the militia of any state and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress the rebellion. That's the Insurrection Act, which is an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. The Insurrection Act would allow the president to call in the military and use soldiers to conduct immigration raids. So if Section 12406 allows the National Guard to protect ICE, the Insurrection Act allows the troops to become ICE. That would effectively militarize law enforcement and allow the president to occupy an American city, which is why California's leaders were so freaked out. And there are strong signals that the military is preparing to act in a law enforcement capacity. Fox News is airing footage of the Marines training to arrest and subdue civilians.
The reality is here, we got hooligans running around and they are causing undue harm to police, and the police need to be backed up.
Hooligans? We're calling out the National Guard for hooligans now? First of all, the LAPD is clearly not overwhelmed and was able to disperse the crowd without much difficulty. In fact, LAPD Chief Jim McConnell put out a statement making it very clear that dumping Marines in the middle of the city is very much not wanted. He said, "The Los Angeles Police Department, alongside our mutual aid partners, have decades of experience managing large-scale public demonstrations, and we remain confident in our ability to do so professionally and effectively." Second, the president is only supposed to be federalizing state militias in cases of a total breakdown of the rule of law, which just isn't happening here, and it's a gross violation of state sovereignty to take away its authority to police its own citizens, which is something DHS Secretary Kristi Noem understood last year when Joe Biden was in the White House. But that was then, and this is now. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, Nuome is asking the Pentagon to authorize troops to detain, that is, arrest people, which is a core law enforcement activity. So either she's asking the Defense Department to violate the Posse Comitatus Act, or she's preparing to be on a different legal footing. Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, is openly calling it an insurrection, and so is Trump. But California is a big state, and it's got the resources to fight. First, Governor Newsom called Homan's thuggish bluff.
Has been here 10 years. The fear, the horror. The hell is this guy? Come after me, arrest me. Let's just get it over with. Tough guy. You know, I don't give a damn. But I care about my community. I care about this community. The hell are they doing? These guys need to grow up. They need to stop. And we need to push back. And I'm sorry to be so clear, but that kind of bloviating is exhausting.
Thanks, Gavin. Then he filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of California. That case, appropriately captioned Newsom v. Trump, alleges that Section 12406 requires the president to go through the governor, not just unilaterally summon the National Guard. And so federalizing the California National Guard without consent of the governor is ultra vires, which is law talk for outside the law and legally null and void. The suit says that at no point in the past 3 days has there been a rebellion or an insurrection, nor have these protests risen to the level of protests or riots that Los Angeles and other major cities have seen at points in the past, including in recent years. He contrasted it with the Rodney King riots, which involved thousands of people across Los Angeles County, resulting in multiple shootouts, over 60 deaths, thousands of people injured, and more than 12,000 arrests. The implication being that was an appropriate invocation of the Guard, and this is very clearly not. Newsom pointed out that federal officials did not provide the Los Angeles Sheriff Department or the LAPD with any notice as to the planned operations or otherwise attempt to coordinate activities to protect the safety of the public, which is why they had to call out for CHIPS to rescue them when they went looking for trouble and found it.
Someone could get hurt!
I'm kidding. It wasn't Dax Shepard riding to the rescue. It was these guys. But when ICE called, the LAPD did show up and protect ICE as requested. Newsom says that if ICE hadn't been deliberately provocative and freaked people out, then things wouldn't have gotten out of hand. He said agents engaged in military-style operations sparked panic in the community. In some instances, ICE agents were reportedly observed sealing off entire streets around targeted buildings and using unmarked armored vehicles equipped with paramilitary gear. He says that the LAPD and Sheriff Department have substantial training and experience responding to protests and large-scale riots and have been responding promptly, professionally, and effectively to the events unfolding in the city and county. Translation: there is no rioting or rebellion or insurrection, and unlike ICE, local law enforcement is trained to diffuse rather than inflame the situation. The complaint cites the ambiguous wording of President Trump's declaration, which suggests potential misuse of the federalized National Guard, since it's unclear what actions Secretary Hegseth will deem as reasonably necessary to ensure the protection and safety of federal personnel and property. It says that the Trump administration has made it clear that it intends to use National Guard members to effectuate interior civil immigration enforcement, and warns that violation of the Posse Comitatus Act is imminent, if not already underway, which is a big accusation. Or it would be if Trump weren't constantly going on television to talk about all the things he wants to do with those troops. Really? You need soldiers for this? In addition to filing the complaint over the weekend, on Tuesday morning, the state of California moved for an immediate temporary restraining order. The state argued that unless the court stepped in to stop the Trump administration, those federalized National Guardsmen would be used to perform ICE functions in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. As State Attorney General Rob Bonta put it, the President and Secretary Hijacks have made clear, publicly and privately, that the Marines are not in Los Angeles to stand outside a federal building. Specifically, the state got word that those federalized troops would be holding a secure perimeter in communities around areas where immigration enforcement activities would take place and securing routes over public streets where immigration enforcement officers would travel. And that sounds a lot like crossing the line between supposedly defending ICE agents from protesters and actively aiding ICE in conducting raids, which would definitely violate the Posse Comitatus Act. And Hexeth more or less confirmed it, saying that 700 active duty U.S. Marines from Camp Pendleton are being deployed to Los Angeles to restore order. He also added a gratuitous dig at Newsom, claiming that we have an obligation to defend federal law enforcement officers, even if Gavin Newsom will not, which is kind of nuts, considering the LAPD turned out in force to scare off those hooligans throwing water bottles at the poor defenseless ICE agents. While AG Bonta may be right about what's about to happen, getting what's called anticipatory relief is a heavy lift. Typically, a temporary restraining order is used to preserve the status quo. Courts almost never issue a TRO to prevent conduct that might or might not happen. But that's not the end of the story. Just because the state might not get the immediate injunction does not mean they won't get one when and if the National Guard is used in a way that violates Posse Comitatus. And California has some very good legal arguments about the illegality of invoking Section 12406 and federalizing the Guard over the governor's objections. I mean, even if Trump can persuade a court that a rebellion is whatever he says it is, the plain language of Section 12406 requires that any federalization orders shall be issued through the governors of the states, and this one was not. And if Trump's federalization order was unlawful, that means the federal government has stolen resources that properly belong to the state of California. And we are heading into wildfire season when the state often needs to deploy the National Guard to actually help its citizens, which it won't be able to do if Pete Hegseth is dragging the National Guard around the country to form a human shield around ICE agents every time they think there might be a protest. The 10th Amendment says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That's federalism. And it means that the federal government cannot commandeer state resources to carry out federal policy. Here, it sure seems like the federal government is taking California's resource, i.e. its National Guard troops, in violation of the Constitution. So it's all kicking off, and Trump seems pretty committed to the bit. Here he is at Fort Bragg taking credit for stopping a mob from burning down LA the way he single-handedly put out the wildfires by turning on the magical non-existent spigot of water. None of that happened. And yet, Trump seems dead set on pushing his version of LA as a violent hellscape where the LAPD is cowering in fear of hooligans, and the only thing that can save them is the U.S. military. Whose version of reality will win out? Will it be the Trump administration's dark vision of a city under siege, or the peaceful protesters sitting in the street singing Kumbaya? These are dark and dangerous times, and the summer is just beginning. Now, it's super interesting to see how the media is covering this. Over the weekend, over 380 sources covered Trump deploying the National Guard with a fairly even distribution of 35% from the left, 30% from the center, and 35% from the right. And when you examine the headlines, you see very different frames emerge that shape how readers interpret and understand what happened and why. Sources on the right place heavy emphasis on the actions of the crowd, framing them as a riot against Trump's intent to liberate Los Angeles from a migrant invasion. Sources on the left, however, were most likely to describe the crowd as a protest instead of a riot, with a few sources speculating that Trump could use this as a full authoritarian takeover attempt of the United States. And then, in the center, sources tend to focus on Trump's statements and how California leaders responded to them. The headlines you read first have immense power to shape how you understand the news, and that's why I like to see the news from as many angles as I can with the help of today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. And right now, they're offering LegalEagle viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. Scan the QR code or use the link in the description to get the discount for a limited time. Or simply download the Ground News mobile app and enter LegalEagle, all one word, as the discount code. Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite parts is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. This can be especially helpful when reading stories from sources you've never heard of, where there's no telling who owns it or what agenda they might have. I also love their blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum, like this related story of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth suggesting that the U.S. Marines could be deployed to Los Angeles. This story was largely ignored by the left, with less than 10% of sources reporting. This type of analysis helps explain why we often talk past each other and why some people seem hyper-focused on what to others seems like nonsense or fake news. Ground News is my favorite way to get the news, and as LegalEagle, you can save 40% off the Ground News Vantage subscription by scanning the code on screen or clicking on the link down below. This subscription gives you unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and blind spot feed, and by subscribing, you'll support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. So click the link below or scan the code today. And after that, click on this link for more LegalEagle, or we will see you in court.